Imagine your favorite book or story. What if you never read it? What if the ending were different from the one you know? How would that change your feelings about the work or about the author, about the characters? When we hear the word censorship, we think of the most dramatic examples of book burning, authors thrown into jail, the best works of literature suppressed forever. We can recite the titles of famously censored works like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or The Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, Lolita, even Harry Potter. Yes, Harry Potter, believe it or not, was censored for its satanic elements, for exposing children to the occult. It is hard to imagine that books that seem so harmless to us now once caused riots leading to death threats on the life of the author, all because they were considered too dangerous for the reading public. Take, for example, Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, or Dr. Seuss's Hop on Pop. Beloved children's books considered too violent or too obscene or age inappropriate for young readers. Hop on Pop was removed from library shelves because it purportedly encouraged violence against fathers. This is a book that former First Lady Laura Bush told Time magazine in 2006 was her favorite book of the year, precisely because it evoked all kinds of warm memories of her husband reading to her daughters at bedtime. You just never know how a book will be received once it's out there, because we can't control the censor's interpretation of a book. But my point is that in crucial ways, books do shape our lives as children, and in some ways we can't imagine our lives today without them. And yet some, although written, came very close to being forbidden to readers forever. Now, we are all familiar with the kind of censorship in which a state government decides a book should not be read. But what if your favorite book were altered even before it became the book you know? What if it started out as something quite different from the book that you read and that you love? What if it contained language or scenes which shocked you or stunned you, horrified you? What if it made you cry instead of laugh at its ending? I'm talking about a kind of censorship that most readers are not aware of because it happens while a book is not yet a book and in manuscript form. Editorial censors are the editors and the publishers who take the raw literary material and alter it, morph it. Sometimes they change it to the point where it bears very little resemblance to the original. Now, there are some famous cases of editorial censorship that might surprise you. The Brothers Grimm. So they collected and retold some of our favorite fairy tales from childhood, like Rapunzel, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, just to name a few. Yet the reading public has only recently discovered the first published editions of these tales. And originally, these stories were very dark. Cannibalism, incest, fratricide. I'm saying they were grim. But we know from these first editions that these authors were not censored. For instance, in Rapunzel, Wilhelm Grimm shows something happening between the prince and the girl in the tower that is not so innocent. And these details were edited out in subsequent editions. Their stories were full of violence and sex and horror. But we have to remember that children were not the intended audience. And also, the Brothers Grimm were not the authors of these tales. They merely collected them. These were stories handed down from generations in Europe. They merely collected them in one place. Now, the Grimm stories we know today have been sanitized, just in order to be read to children at bedtime. Censorship happened at the level of editors. We might think, Thank goodness those editors intervened, because I know that I would have been one very traumatized 5-year-old. A more recent example of this kind of censorship concerns the Nobel Prize-winning author Albert Camus. He was an Algerian-born Frenchman writing in the 1940s, 1950s, just after World War II. He wrote plays, he wrote novels, he wrote short stories, philosophical essays. He was an extremely popular writer in France. His novel, The Stranger, L'étranger, sold millions of copies worldwide, and it was translated 4 times into English. Even the British band The Cure wrote a song based on the novel, Killing an Arab. It is considered one of the most influential books of our time. The Nobel Prize Committee awarded him this honor in 1957 for important literary production, which with clear-sighted earnestness illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our times. He was known for his philosophy of the absurd, which in this country is known as existentialism, a label he hated. He was also known quickly in this country as a European writer, aligned with European values and expressing a kind of European sensibility. But in reality, he was a man of the Mediterranean. He had more in common with other French colonists living in Algeria at this time, just on the brink of separating definitively from France. He was the furthest thing from a French existentialist. But this is what his editor, Blanche Knopf, thought would sell best. So this is how she marketed him to his new English-speaking audience. And here's a picture of Blanche arm in arm with Camus at the Nobel Prize ceremony in 1957. If we take a look at some of the letters that she exchanged with Camus' literary agent, we can see that she cared less about accurate translations and a faithful representation of the author, and more about selling books. She wrote in one letter dated July 9, 1945, "As for the translation of Camus' L'étranger, I should certainly, in principle, oppose showing a translation to the author of the original. I cannot think of an easier way to generate trouble. A little knowledge is dangerous, and a lot of knowledge even more so in matters of this kind. I am sure that Stuart Gilbert can be counted on to do a good job." Well, we know he did not do a good job. Readers familiar with the original quickly denounced the translation. They claimed he must have barely known French to have so butchered it. One writer said, "The translator has committed numerous and serious errors of translation and has even denatured the work of Camus, either in changing handkerchiefs into bookcases, in suppressing a revolution in favor of a wildfire, or even introducing snow in the context of Oran," and that's a coastal Algerian city that wasn't there in the original. Mr. Gilbert gives a false and mistaken image of Camus, and I find it terrible that this is the only image that the immense English public will receive. I consider this a literary scandal. It would be 43 years before a new translation would come out. And in the meantime, what we have is a book that in some ways betrayed the reality and the voice of this very important writer. Now, there are subtle ways that an editor can rework the material to fit a different audience. Sometimes it means taking a manuscript and cutting it down significantly, sometimes eliminating 40% of the original manuscript just to fit the attention span of the new audience. In Camus' case, this gives the impression that his essays are all chopped up and truncated. His philosophical arguments seem unsubtle. And what we have really missed is his sharp sense of the reality around him. For instance, he felt particularly strong about the future of his native Algeria, just as it was gaining independence from France and establishing itself as an independent nation. He wrote passionately about his solution to what he called the Algerian crisis. But we Anglophones didn't have access to these essays for 50 years after Algerian independence. A Nobel Prize-winning author and his works were censored for 50 years. But what happened to his friend, fellow writer André Gide is perhaps worse. Here's a letter that shows what Blanche Knopf did to his work. She writes to his translator, "Thanks for that note about Gide for the counterfeiters, which we are using, but I had to take out the homosexual and communist part." I guess 1947 was not a good time to be writing about communism or homosexuality. But this kind of repackaging of an author's work happens all the time. We just aren't aware of it as readers of the final product. Writers are at the mercy of their editors, just as musicians are trapped often by their producers. Artists are inherently disadvantaged for this reason. Now, what we have to remember about this whole story of the relationship between writer and editor, that when it comes down to it, the editor has the final say. When it comes to publishing a book, his or her motivations often come down to profit or what he or she thinks will appeal to a reader. In other words, the book that gets published is the one that the editor and the publisher thinks will sell best and make the most for the company. Editors have that much power over an author's work. Now back to Camus. He was trying to say one thing, but his English audience heard something else. Now, did that diminish or tarnish his reputation as a writer of universal themes? Maybe, maybe not, but we will never know. But these editorial cuts and mistranslations tell us that there lies a vast distance between what Camus wrote and what his publisher published in his name. It makes us wonder what other favorite books of ours are merely a distorted echo of the author's words. Here are some ways for us to become more reflective literary citizens. Start by asking questions of what we read. Am I reading what the author wrote or how he or she understood it? Were portions of the original left out in what I have in print? Was a dangerous book written and then suppressed and then replaced with another book, perhaps with a softer message? What is the history behind this work I love so much? And believe it or not, some research on the internet will get you these answers. What I'm saying here is that language is so powerful and books are dangerous, but that is why we love them. We owe it to ourselves to learn the backstory in order to get the full story behind the stories we love. Thank you.